My name is Laura Neitzel, Senior Fellow in Global Thought. Thank you for viewing Youth in a Changing World, Aspirations and Anxieties, a conversation among global youth leaders Joshua Amponsem, Rika Gupta, and Charity Ropati, moderated by Dr. Vishakha Desai. This conversation, held on September 29th, 2025, on Columbia University's Morningside campus, commemorated the launch of the multi-year Youth in a Changing World project conducted by the Committee on Global Thought. First, a little history about this project. In 2017, the Committee on Global Thought hosted a day-long global think-in that convened scholars, students, business people, journalists, and policymakers, both in person and virtually, at Columbia's then 9 global centers and here in New York City. The question that those 60-plus individuals across so many time zones grappled with that day was, what is of the most concern to you from the perspective of your part of the world? You can imagine that we heard many things that day, but one thing surprised us. In every single location, people spoke of their concerns about young people. Young people charged with fixing climate change, young people facing structural barriers to employment, young people navigating new digital worlds, young people in the midst of increasingly polarized politics, and the list continued. So in true CGT fashion, we realized that we needed to convene more conversations, this time with young people around the world, to speak with them about their lives and their views of the future, and thus Youth in a Changing World was born. Between 2018 and 2021, we convened 16 workshops in Brazil, China, France, India, Jordan, Kenya, Lebanon, Tunisia, Turkey, and the United States. Working with our close partners at the Columbia Global Centers, without whom this project would not have been possible, and I can't state that strongly enough. We identified local organizations and universities to host workshops. Guided by the principle that this project should not only be about young people, but also by them, we trained youth at each organization to lead the conversations as peer facilitators. And youth were part of every single stage of this project, from planning to writing. Interrupted by the pandemic in 2020, we pivoted to digital convenings. At the time, a tremendous disruption, but in retrospect, it offered us a unique lens on the adaptability of young people making their way in the midst of a global crisis. All told, we spoke to over 400 young people of 25 nationalities. In addition to speaking about their lives, we asked them to draw them too, leaving us with a rich repository of conversations and drawings that became the material for the digital publication. In this publication, you will find a portrait of a generation that has been shaped by constant exposure to transnational flows of information and culture, young people who move fluidly between local and global frames of reference, seeing themselves simultaneously as citizens of their neighborhoods and of the world. The young people we met were not apathetic, but acutely aware of both the possibilities they possess and the barriers that confine them. Many felt failed by education systems that prepare them for jobs that no longer exist. They were politically active, but often through channels that older generations dismissed as unserious. They were highly conscious of inequality and privilege, yet perceived little opportunity to alter entrenched hierarchies. What the study revealed most clearly, and with profound implications for educators and policymakers, is that uncertainty has become the defining attribute of youth today. But uncertainty is not the same as hopelessness. Many participants expressed optimism about human ingenuity, technological potential, and the capacity of collective action. Their optimism is our hope. As you check out the publication at youth.cgt.columbia.edu, I'd ask that you take a few minutes to look at the people page that lists just some of the individuals who contributed to this project over the past 7 years, whether as members of our advisory committee, comprised of scholars and practitioners working on behalf of youth, as workshop liaisons or peer facilitators, as transcript coders or analysts, or website designers. There are more than 120 individuals listed on that page, and this doesn't include the 400 workshop participants that were the informants for this project. I had the distinct privilege of working with all of those 120 individuals, and together we were able to bring this project to fruition. I'd like to recognize three of them in particular. Vishakha Desai, who was co-PI on the project and was with this project from its inception, also the moderator of this event. Darlene de Bosson, who designed the protocol and workshop structure for the project, and Yasmin Rijeb, who was a workshop participant in Tunisia, who then joined the project as a transcript coder, content analysis, and ultimately co-author on the publication. We are grateful to the United Nations Youth Office for working with us over many months to plan the event that you're about to watch, and for introducing us to our panels. But before the panel commences, we have a special treat, a few words of welcome from United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Youth Affairs, Dr. Philippe Pollier.
Hello, everyone, and greetings from the United Nations headquarters. In a very fastly evolving world, we see change unfolding with extraordinary speed and consequence. As young people today, we find ourselves at the intersection of complex global shifts. From the climate crisis and the technological disruption to conflict, inequality, and uncertainty about the future of work. These forces are shaping not only our daily lives, but also the aspirations and anxieties of young people across the world. At the United Nations Youth Office, our mission is to ensure that your insights and lived expertise are heard, where they matter the most, in the policy-making and decision-making processes that will define our collective future. We are at a pivotal moment in the global youth agenda. The past week, as we commemorated the 30th anniversary of the World Programme of Action for Youth, governments and head of state placed these very issues at the center of the global debate. The message was very clear. The voices of young people are no longer optional, but they are indispensable to global governance, because meaningful participation is not a slogan. It is a principle, and one that affirms that the agency of young people needs to help us to design the worlds they will inherit. It means creating spaces at the United Nations and beyond, where young people are not participants, but they are partners. It means moving from symbolic engagement to real influence. This is why initiatives like Youth in a Changing World are so important, because by amplifying the lived experiences and perspectives of young people across regions, this project reminds us of what is at stake and what becomes possible when youth are at the center of solutions. To all of the young people here today, know that your voices, your ideas, and your leadership matters. The changes we are living cannot be shaped without you, and they will be stronger because of you. I want to extend my deepest congratulations to Dr. Desai and the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University for leading this work. And I look forward to our continued efforts to build a more just, a more inclusive, and a more sustainable future with and for young people.
So first I'd like to introduce Joshua Amponsem, who is a climate advocate from Ghana, whose work focuses on climate action, circular economy, and climate change adaptation, and is the founder of the Green Africa Youth Organization that works to reduce the vulnerability of local communities most at risk for climate impacts due to social and structural inequalities in Africa. Since 2020, he's been an adaptation fellow at the Global Center on Adaptation, and he was a speaker at the 2021 Africa Health Agenda International Conference. He's the lead author of Adapt for Our Future on the role of youth in climate adaptation and has contributed to scientific publications on waste management, resilience, and climate change. Welcome, Joshua. Rika Gupta is the co-founder and CEO of Labhya. Is that how you pronounce it? Good. An India-based education nonprofit that partners with governments to impact the emotional well-being of 2.4 million vulnerable children across 22,000 public schools. She has worked with education nonprofits like Teach for India and Teach for All. Rika has been recognized by the Takeda Foundation as the Best Entrepreneur of 2019, by the UN Youth Office as the Young Leader for the Sustainable Development Goals, and as a Rising Talent 2020 by the Women's Forum for the Economy and Society. She holds a master's in international education policy from Harvard University. Welcome, Rika. Then we have Charity Rupati, who is an education and climate justice advocate, a scientist, and a water engineer. Originally from the native village of Kongikanak, Alaska. Pretty good?
Yeah, that's good. Say Kong. Yeah.
Kong, okay, I'll put the G with the next syllable. Kong Iganak, Alaska. Her work focuses on building pipe and water infrastructure for Native communities in rural Alaska. She was awarded Champion for Change by the Center for Native American Youth for her work in education and climate, and is a Conversation Leadership Awardee of the World Wildlife Fund. Charity was opening speaker at the Time 100 Climate Leadership Forum in 2024. She is also a graduate of Columbia University's School of Engineering, holding a BA in Science in Civil Engineering and Water Resources, but that's not enough. Also concentrations in Earth and Environmental Engineering and Anthropology. So to Charity, welcome back. And moderating our conversation this evening will be my friend and colleague, Vishakha Desai, noted scholar and institutional leader and leading youth activist. Vishakha has been at Columbia for more than a decade, first as a senior advisor for global affairs to the president of Columbia University, and also later as the chair of the Committee on Global Thought. Prior to joining Columbia, Vishakha served as the president and CEO of the Asia Society, an international organization devoted to strengthening connections between Asia and the world through arts, culture, education, and policy. One thing about Vishakha is wherever she is always working on behalf of youth and promoting youth leadership. And so one of her signature accomplishments as president of the Asia Society was the establishment of Asia 21 Fellows, a network of leading Asian and American young leaders. She has served on the boards of many national and international organizations, including Teach for All and AFS International. Recipient of numerous awards and honorary degrees, Vishakha has published scholarly books, as well as an award-winning memoir, World as Family, A Journey of Multi-Rooted Belongings. She is also co-PI on the Youth in a Changing World project and my dear friend. And so with that, I hand it to you.
As Laura sits down, I just want you to give a big round of applause for what she has done to manage this project over such a long period of time, involving, as she said, 125 collaborators. Not an easy task, as all of you know. So please give her a big round of applause. This is fabulous. And I also want to just take a moment to say thank you, Matthew, from the UN Assistant General's Office, and to thank Dr. both Philippe Poirier and all of your team, because you've been with us even when it looked like, how can we really come up with a project and the idea like program today, and including bringing us these three extraordinary leaders. So thank you. So Joshua, Charity, Richa, we already heard about the amazing accomplishments that you have. And if I didn't know how young you were, we would say, it couldn't possibly be that you've done all that you have. I'm not going to ask you about everything you've achieved, but I would love for our audience to know, how did you get there? And what was that one thing that led you to do all the work and the institutions that you're leading and the work you're doing? Let's start with you, Charity.
Thank you. It's so good to see everyone. I'm going to just quickly start by introducing myself in my native language, just to kind of to set it all in place because we are on Lenape-Hoking, which is the land of Lenape here in New York City. Waka wingay bugo yuktunaguvach jaimunga kagunak Alaska
And
and
you
Anchorage,
go a little
Alaska.
closer, yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Charity Ropati. I am Yupik and Samoan. My given name is Aguvach, and I come from the native village of Kagunak, Alaska. You said it perfectly. I really got into this work, especially as an Indigenous person, but someone from the Arctic, because it really started off with a story from my great grandparents. And it's a story that Josh has had to hear a couple of times now this week during Climate Week. But pretty much in the 1960s, my great grandfather relocated our entire community at a time where no one really helped anyone here in this country, our Indigenous community in the southwest of Alaska. He gathered the men, the women, the youth of our community and tied ropes around each of our homes and dragged the homes 11 miles northwest away from the rising waters. He did this without the help of federal government, state aid, local aid, things like Red Cross that exist now. He was able to do this pretty successfully, and today those in the global north and in the west consider this type of move a managed retreat. There's a lot of words for it, mitigated retreat, but to my people, to Indigenous peoples, this type of move was considered survival. But moves like that leave huge scars on communities, and to this day, my community lacks basic infrastructure like clean and running water. So I made the really difficult decision to leave home in Alaska in 2019 and moved from Alaska here to New York City to better understand this decision, but really to understand the permafrost, the rising waters, and how we build infrastructure amidst that. I graduated here last year and became one of the first Alaska Native women to graduate from my department, civil engineering, in its over 270-year history. And now I serve as a water engineer, building water infrastructure, not just for communities like mine, but for Indigenous communities throughout North America. I also now serve as a climate advisor to the UN Secretary General. There's really incredible youth on this, but I share this story in my short amount of time to show you really the ingenuity of Indigenous communities. My great grandfather built sod houses out of wood, mud, and water, while our women use sealskin, which are things that we still use to this day to make our kayaks, which could survive the Bering Sea, the Arctic Ocean. This is who I have behind me, and this is the legacy that I carry. My mom would always tell me that I was born of engineers. And because of that story, I was able to get through some pretty hard times here at the university. And it's what brought me here to this day, continuing to fight to ensure that our rights as Indigenous peoples are upheld, not only in the UN, but also even in co-design when we're designing infrastructure. So that's my story.
Thank you. Terrific. Joshua.
Hi, everyone. I've heard the story a few times, and every single time I hear it, I still go like, wow. It's incredible. It's beautiful. It's resilience by every definition. And this is part of my own journey as well. I come from Ghana, and in my second year of my bachelor program, I took a course, and this was the first time I heard the word climate change. It was a course about coastal zones and how to protect them. And I saw that in my program, a lot of students were very keen to get out of class and do something, but the academic institution or university had it such that, you had a very brilliant lecturer or professor who is super smart, almost have every solution to the problem, and was started in front of us teaching us. And we go like, maybe you should run for president or something, because it seems like you figured it all out and we're just here listening to it. So one day I asked the question, why is it that you have all this knowledge and you're here teaching us and you're not out there doing anything? And he said, it's the role of the professor or the lecturer institution to give us the information we need to know, and it's our responsibility to decide what to do with it. Mm-hmm. And that very day, I gathered a group of 5 people and decided we're going to set up a student organization that will go to communities and immediately start working on coastal protection. As I started doing that work, I immediately realized that there were way more young people out there who want to have an opportunity to not just learn, but to bring their knowledge and insights from classroom into communities and to work together with their families, with their friends, with their communities. But there was a significant problem. Young people don't have access to decision making. They don't have access to influence and power as much as they should. And significantly, they don't have access to resources. So from my little work in Ghana, I started working across Africa, managed to do my master's at the United Nations University in Germany at the UN, got closer to the UN, understand this architecture, started consulting and supporting international organizations to develop strategies to bring young people closer to decision making. And I work with the United Nations Youth and Voice Office, now the Youth Office. And all through that process, one thing kept coming up: finance, access to resources, access to funding. So at some point, I left that job, and together with some peers, we set up the Youth Climate Justice Fund, which is now a fund that provides funding to youth-led grassroots leaders to be able to do the amazing work they do and to be able to have the ability to keep creating stories of inspiration, stories of resilience, and stories of ambition, because we're missing that in this world. So that's briefly who I am.
Amazing. Thank you.
It's going to be hard to follow that. I'm a teacher turned entrepreneur. And I spent some time teaching in low-income classrooms across India since I was 16 years old, first as a volunteer and then as a full-time teacher. And one of the initial things I realized as an educator was that there's such a huge difference between me teaching and children actually learning. And it could have partly been because I was a bad teacher, but but it really also was because most of my children came from really difficult backgrounds. They saw violence, abuse, trauma almost on a daily basis, even before walking into school, and they were just too stressed to learn. And I started questioning what I could do more. I started researching around what we could do more for our children. But what really was a turning point for me was, unfortunately, when I lost two of my students. One was to community violence right outside of the school gates, and another was to a disease that I had recovered from when I was a child. And I think beyond how I felt about this and dealt with this, I saw how the 12, 13-year-old kids in my classroom at an age where they're supposed to just worry about whether to do homework or not, or, who to play with, who to share my food with, they're now sitting with all this grief and all this fear, and they don't know what to do with it. And that really made me question my own purpose as an educator. It took me a while to kind of take a step back. And I also saw that, to the outside world, none of this actually mattered. There were no big newspaper articles about my kids not being there. They were just statistics in the larger scheme of things. And that made me really angry. And I think that's when I met with my co-founders, Vedant and Malika, to start what is now Labhya, where we partner with governments to help them institutionalize daily well-being classes across all public schools of the states that we work with in India, to make sure that no other child has to live in that kind of fear, and every child has the kind of skill set they need to get through life, no matter where they come from. We currently work with 4 state governments, 2.4 million children, but I think beyond the numbers, what we're trying to do is help the world understand that well-being unlocks learning. And if a child is not regulated, you can give them the best education in the world, and it's just not going to work.
Thank you. Thanks. I think all of you have touched on some very important issues. Some of these issues are also things that we learned in the Youth in a Changing World. That one thing that really struck me, for example, is that both of you have now known each other. You're in this global arena. You're here for the UN, you know the world, as well as what you're doing at the local level for the work you're doing there. One of the findings that we had was that actually younger people today are very aware that the world is in their palm in the cell phone. They're very aware of what's happening out there in the world. But with it also comes a certain level of anxiety. And that is that if I can be aware of everything, what if I belong nowhere? Or how do I deal with this local global conundrum? And it seems to me that especially what you're describing, you're talking about this, you're out there in the world, really doing important work. How are you navigating this kind of global, local conundrum relationship, where it is, and what are the challenges in trying to navigate that? You start, we'll just change. So you start now. Yeah.
I'm gonna start.
Right.
So I'll start from the first time I got the chance to attend a global event, right? So this was 2016, and I went for my first big climate conference, COP22 in Marrakesh. And prior to that, my understanding of the world was this, right? My parents are farmers, come from a farming community. You face dry spells, not really drought, dry spells. Some of the crops fail. Sometimes you get heavy rains, there is flooding, you lose a lot. None of this was really, from my perspective, a global issue. This is me and my community. This is what we see. Started working on climate, working with communities, trying to do everything possible based on the knowledge we have locally to do this. Now I get invited by some random organization to come to something called COP by the UNFCCC. I arrive in Marrakesh, thousands of people talking about climate change. Okay, so this is a big deal. It's a big topic. Okay. I get into that. I see farmer groups that are trying to represent themselves. I see indigenous communities trying to represent themselves. And it struck me, okay, so we're dealing with something that is hyper local, really local, because what happens in community A is very different from what happens in community B. And I couldn't fit that in a global context. But at the same time, I'm at a conference where there are people from everywhere in the world trying to have some sort of representation on how they see the issue. And my understanding of that was basically this: we would need a framework for something that affects everyone globally. So we need to work on that framework. But that framework almost doesn't make any sense if there are not people who can take it back home and work on it locally. So while that was like really sort of mind-blowing to see the scale of the issue, how many people are involved, I remember literally seeing John Kerry one morning going for a walk before the conference, and I'm just in awe, like, damn, I'm here, I'm seeing all of this, all these people are here, and they all care about this topic. And it was the 22nd time it was happening. And I was like, okay, so 22 years this has been going on. What happens? Right. And for me, it was a responsibility of being able to really take a lot of those insights that happen at that global level and be able to bring back to my community and translate that from national government to sub-national government, working with local communities and ensuring that whatever is being agreed, whatever framework it is, there are resources available for local communities to be able to feed into it. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. I went back to Ghana and realized that aside the national government sitting in the capital, if I asked any other person, any sub-national government, what this conference was, what was agreed, what was happening, it was nothing for them. Like, they had no idea what was going on. And so for me, this was a sign of, okay, we have work to do in translating some of this big vision into practical things for everyday life. The second thing I saw was even how young people had to fight to get a space within these events. And yet everyone was talking about the future. So from 2016, up until pre-pandemic, I became part of a group called Yongo that did a lot of work with the UN to create several spaces for young people to be able to show up at these conferences and be able to have a seat at the table. At the end, we managed to get the UNFCCC to actually make it mandatory for that every committee within the UNFCCC that have a meeting, they should have a youth representative. But there comes another challenge. You have a seat at the table, but everyone else coming to that table have quite a good amount of resources to prepare them for that. And then there's sort of young people. What is all these young people? There are children, there are students, there are researchers, there are early career sort of professionals. There's not a single definition almost for youth. So who is going to take that seat? And how are they being supported to prepare for those meetings? So that became a new challenge that we had to really fight.
And in some cases, we found that the definition of what counts as young people is quite different.
Exactly.
In some places in Africa, it can go all the way to 40 years old.
That's a bit much,
Whereas-
but yeah.
Exactly. On the other hand, somewhere else, it's like 22, that's it.
Exactly.
And so that in itself becomes a problem with who is a young leader in that.
Exactly. And I think, it's going to be a continuous thing of when it comes to global, local, when it
Right.
comes to accessibility and tracking progress so that we can keep advancing. And I think right now, one of the things I see is that there is not enough appreciation sometimes for the work that I've gone into creating spaces, safe spaces for young people to show up. The same way there's not enough appreciation for the fact that you need to support them to show up. If not, they cannot show up the same way that your prime minister is showing up, the CEO of a business is showing up, the head of an institution who have PR staff, a PA,
Right.
someone booking their flights, sorting out their logistics. All of that work is done by someone else.
Right.
And for young people, it's like, go figure it out by yourself. And we expect you to show up and be brilliant. So this is some of the gaps that we see. But I think in general, for me, when I think of that local and global interaction, I think that a lot of the global work are important to give us a sense of direction, but we won't make any step towards that direction if we do not resource locally.
So that how you actually connect the global to local and local to global matters a lot. Any quick word on that? And otherwise we'll go, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that was an excellent answer and description to that question. I think for me, with what I've seen in my past 2 years of experience in the UNFCCC space, is there's really a lot to learn from Indigenous organizations that enter these spaces, from the creation of how COP became a thing. Organizations like Inuit Circumpolar Council, organizations like Sami Council, which are incredible Arctic Indigenous organizations, have been involved since the very first step. And since the very first conference, they've been including youth delegations to come with them. So they're training young Inuit, young Sami to come into these spaces. And in my past 2 years of experience being an Inuit youth delegate, these things are translated from an international, national, but even to a local, from indigenous communities. The decisions that we make, the statements that we make in the UNFCCC space, they're all consensus based. And ICC, Inuit Circumpolar Council, represents over 180,000 people across Russia, Canada, Greenland, and Alaska. There's a lot to learn from Indigenous diplomacy, but specifically the diplomacy that exists with Indigenous communities in the Arctic. And something that we've been talking a lot about is that there is a lot of global conflict that happens right now. But despite the conflict that exists, Indigenous peoples, not only in the Arctic, but throughout the world, are able to maintain their relationship with each other across borders. Because just like our sea mammals who don't know borders, we as Indigenous peoples in the Arctic, don't know borders as well. And we're still able to maintain our relationship with our relatives in Russia. And I think that's incredible. That's beautiful. And there's a lot to learn from that. But all of the decisions that we make in the UNFCCC space as an Indigenous org, all consensus based, ensuring that everyone's represented, but also we consider the rights of future generations. It's integral in Indigenous values.
Well, I think partly what you're saying is that it's not just local, global, it's also trans-border.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another kind of connections, just making things more complicated and complex, you know. Richa, we will start with actually a slightly different question. And that is that all of you are becoming this kind of global presence, and you still have work to do at home. Are you finding that challenging to manage that, or some things have to give somewhere? What gives?
Thank you for that question. I don't think it's a stretch. I think it's an enabler for the work that we do on the ground. And this is something I realized when I started working with the UN Youth Office as a young leader for the Sustainable Development Goals. I was already running my nonprofit. We're a 300-member team back home, full-time, doing this work with governments. It's real work with kids on ground. And when I came here, the office worked with us quite hard on firstly helping us articulating the work that we do, why we do the work that we do, and why is it important to focus on this specific thing right now. And I feel like the last 2 years of working with the office have helped me not only gather more consensus around the need to invest in children's mental health and well-being, but also active resources towards the work that we do. And I think before I started this work, I thought this was just an India problem, like just like Joshua was sharing, I was like, oh, there's 190 million kids in public schools across India, and it would be a huge deal to even just work with them. But when I came to the UN, I was like, no, there's 1 billion kids who experience multidimensional poverty across the world, and each one of them require well-being. So how can we build a global movement and think globally and act locally, but really build a movement globally around with champions here? And I think so. I look at it more as an enabler than a stretch.
That exactly, because I think partly sometimes we have a tendency to put it as either or. And what all of you are saying is that right from the get-go, you're seeing the connection, which I think is very important. And you deal with the mental health issue. One of the things we found in this study is that across the world, all the places we were in, mental well-being was very much highlighted by young people. And it was something that some of us thought it was only in one part, not another. They may be different causes, but they all have it. And so is this something that are you coming across in the work? I was just at the UN youth meeting where, again, these youth leaders, they were saying that they've been in this business for a while, and there is a fatigue, there's a mental fatigue. And there is also, therefore, other kinds of mental issues. There are competition. I wonder how you all think about that, because there's also the issue of maybe it's too much information all the time. As I mentioned to some of you, that Adam Tooze has really talked about this notion of polycrisis, that you're living in multiple crises all at once, and the pace of change is so hard. Do you think that that's causing this? What is behind this idea of the mental well-being, especially for this generation?
A few things from my perspective. So I've worked with young people from around the world. I manage a fund now. We fund youth movements. One of the significant things that I think have changed in the past 10 years, when I started this work and now, is we've grown a bit more in empathy compared to sympathy. And I'll explain that a little bit. 10 years ago, when there was a flooding in Ethiopia, you see the headline on the news, you feel sorry for people who are there, you go on with your day. That's it. Like, there's not much you can do. There's flooding in Ethiopia, and that's it. Right? It's sad, it's all of that, go. Now there's flooding in Ethiopia. You have videos of it everywhere. Right? You have friends, whether you've met them before or you're connecting with them in the movement, and they're giving you updates like every day. This is what is happening, that is going on. And that automatically shifts you from being sympathetic with them and being empathic with them, because this is your friend. You have an actual connection with this person. You're seeing it live. And I think that really does something to us as people. It wants us, it makes us want to do something, but then in many ways we are limited in what we can do. And because we don't have our health infrastructure is not designed to respond to a lot of these. In many parts in the world, there is no health infrastructure for mental well-being at all, right? We are funding a youth group in Nigeria that is beginning to work with families that have been through the Niger oil Delta case with Shell. And this is years of court cases on oil spills on their lands. And it's been going on for decades, and there's not really anything out of it yet. And no one has thought about how do these families feel, and how do we support them? And there's no infrastructure for that, right? So I think that in many cases, or in different cases, the trigger for the anxiety or the nervousness or the burnouts or feeling incapable can come from several factors. A big part for sure is the access to information that we have and the format of which we have it. The second part is because we are growing in empathy, we are not choosing sides anymore, right? It's not like I'm a climate activist and that is it. If there is global economic crisis, I don't care. I just care about climate, and that's the only thing. It doesn't work like that anymore, right? Because we are able to sort of understand much broader beyond the issues that we primarily care about, either because we studied it or because we have a life experience that made us move towards
information is easy to access.
So now we understand more, we see more, and at the same time, we are limited in our ability to respond to it very effectively. And I think that is really growing.
Right.
It doesn't mean that we cannot do anything about it.
Right.
Right. So when I think of some of the groups that we are supporting, simple things we do is asking youth groups that we fund and tell them, no, what about you add $2,000 extra to your budget so you can have a team retreat, every 6 months. Go to a nice place and have a nice time and play some games and be with your community and not make it all about the work, because the work is always going to be there one way or the other. This climate issue is not going anywhere, right? With AI and everything coming in, the energy demand, you will have big problems to solve. So don't burn yourself out now, because we need you for the long haul.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
It's a marathon. And I think in the context of a marathon, we need to resource well-being. We need to fund people to take care of themselves. They need to pay themselves well. They need to have decent salaries. They need contracts. They need social benefits. They need health benefits to the work that they do. And it will surprise you how many young people work unpaid, right? Or do volunteering work and think that it's guilty to pay themselves. So that is some of the things I think we can actively do. And then the second part on the big task we have on fighting misinformation and disinformation. This is going to be a big struggle for the next few years, of course, with the tech revolution and the AI revolution. I think a lot more efforts are needed to really understand how do we get the right information to young people, knowing that depending on where you are and your exposure level, you might not have what it takes to discern what is true anymore.
It's just another cause for more anxiety about
Exactly.
what to
Exactly.
pay attention to.
Exactly. So I think we need to fund that and heavily invest in this. And then the third thing is we need to invest in our health infrastructure. That well-being can become part of healthcare. Of course, in some developed economies, this is already there. But I can tell you that across sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of young people are waking up uncertain about what the next rainy season is going to look like, and they have no structure.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I did the workshop in Kenya, and one of the things that came up was, on the one hand, there is this real constraints of making a living. But then they see all these things from around the world, and it causes more anxiety that you know what's possible, but you can't get there. So it's also about all of them feeling, many of them, that their parents could expect what their life was going to be like. That given where we are today, there is no way of knowing what their life is going to be, because how to navigate the changes becomes a big problem. And I think that comes back to also education. And that's one of the things that we also found, is that lots and lots of young people around the world felt that the education was failing them. Now, mind you, more than 75% of these people we worked with were college students. So they were in college, and they were talking mainly about education, both secondary and higher education. And yet both of you talked about education was an important part of your own kind of energy to get going. And yet a lot of young people are feeling that education as we know it is failing them. And I don't know how many of you feel that way, but you might. So we figured we might ask you if there was one thing you wanted education to do and change, what would that change be? Just one thing. I don't want a long story. Go ahead.
I think if there's one thing that education, that we could change in education, is probably add more critical thinking to the way that we learn. Because I was also hearing from what Joshua was sharing, I think if we can just learn to understand what's in our circle of control, where we can take action, and what is something beyond us, a lot of our anxiety, this is something we teach our kids in classrooms as well. A lot of our anxiety and many other worrying factors can reduce.
So it's both about critical thinking and connecting to action.
Yeah.
That's what is that?
Yes.
Okay. Let's take Charity and then come back down.
There's a huge outmigration problem that happens with youth, especially in the Arctic. I think what we're seeing is that to be seen as successful, there's this thought that you have to leave your community, you have to leave your indigenous community to be successful, and that's not the case. With education wise, we need to see traditional forms of learning as a valid form, as a valid mechanism of like knowledge. It's an expertise, being able to live on the land, being able to hunt for the things that we have for thousands of years. We need to invest in communities like that, and our youth shouldn't be forced to quite frankly come to places like this that are incredibly difficult, where you're the first in your department to enter, but also where more times than not we see, especially at a time like now here in this country where human rights are being infringed on. We shouldn't have to leave our communities to get a good quality education. So we need to invest in Indigenous communities and Black communities, not only here in this country, but throughout the world, so that our youth aren't forced to leave home.
For people who are less, perhaps seen as less privileged, even if they would not be. Yeah. No, very important. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't have one thing. So that's
Only one thing.
I don't have one. That's the problem. So I'll say two things.
Okay.
One of them is I think we are educating people for the past and not for the future.
Right.
I consider myself part of those. Everything I studied in my bachelor and master's program, half of them have been rendered useless just with AI alone.
Right.
Like a lot of them don't apply anymore. It's like the world is moving way too fast and it's difficult to catch up with it. And I think education is not, the academic institutions we have today are not moving as fast towards the future and lean more towards what has happened in the past. And I think we need to change that. The second thing I think is going to be defining for the world ahead of us for young people is being able to train young people to sit with discomfort, be able to disagree, and be okay with that.
Right.
This is so important because when I think of all the young people we fund and how much frustration comes from disagreement because they think the world is going one way and they think it should go the other way, that is what the world is. We need to be able to sit with it. And I think those are things that typically you will get a lot of this from the community you live in. The community I grew up in, you have discomfort, you have disagreement, you stay in that community.
Right.
You don't pack your bag and just walk the other way. But now we don't have those communities anymore, right? We are all shielded either by our screen, by the nature of just urban planning, and everything doesn't allow us to interact. And I think it's going to come back to academic institutions to really think about how do we educate the next generation and sort of younger generations to be able to sit with discomfort, be able to disagree with people, and still be in community.
Right.
Because we would have to do very tough negotiations with the world ahead of us to be able to navigate the way forward.
And so part of it is critical thinking and at the same time ability to listen and also agree to disagree and then move forward. And that is less subject oriented than it is about the skills that would come in no matter where you go and what you do. And you've kind of talked about this idea of youth as change makers and youth being at the center of the table. One of the other findings we have in our project is that lots and lots of young people around the world feel that often they're told that they're apathetic, that they don't want to engage, but that it's more because they feel that the system set up are not helpful to them to engage in. They care a lot, but there are not enough structures. So there are too many barriers. What are the kind of barriers that you have faced? You all are already accomplished. You're seen as a leader. Give me one example of a barrier that you felt like you had to break through. Let's start with you, Charity. And we don't have to, all of you don't have to talk about it, but let's just get that out there.
Yeah, it's like what I said earlier. There's a huge, we call it a brain drain in the Arctic, where many youth are forced to leave their communities for quote unquote success, which is how do we define success? Success for who, especially in the Western world. And having, for me, coming here to this university was the hardest thing ever. Yeah, it was. And I think with what we've seen, and it's difficult and it's hard, and we're living in a time where there's increased censorship, where there's increased fascism in this country, and it's put on youth to be brave enough to say these things, when all together adults, global leaders need to be just as brave as we are. And they know what's happening, but I think most people are too scared to really put a pin in it, to say these things. So it requires all of us to, I don't like calling it a burden, but to really carry this burden together, because more times than not, it's placed on youth. More times than not, it's placed on Indigenous communities. It's placed on farmers. It's placed on local communities, to kind of figure this out ourselves, to ensure the survival of the next generation. We're at a time where it's not gonna, it shouldn't just be us recognizing this pattern, but also saying that there is increased fascism, that there is all of these things, but also linking the climate crisis to the human rights crisis. These things are inextricably linked, right? And even saying that there's risk to that. And frontline activists, Indigenous activists, Black activists, we're at risk when we're saying these things. So all of us, we need to collectively do better, develop critical thinking, but also protect our youth so that there is a safe space so that we could say these things. But yeah, out my having to leave my home to be here to ensure that our rights are upheld, but also to ensure that when people talk about the Arctic, that they're also including us, right? Because I think when people talk about the Arctic, they only talk about our animals. It's not just that. It's not just our polar bears going hungry. I care about them too. It's our people. The biggest issue in the Arctic is hunger. It's food insecurity. And when our sea ice is no longer there, how else are we supposed to hunt? These are things that just can't regenerate. A huge salmon crisis, all of these things. So I'm ensuring that in being here in New York City, whether it's at the UN, whether it's even at forums like this, that when we talk about youth, we have to talk about Arctic Indigenous youth. We have to talk about Pacific Island youth. We have to talk about Indigenous youth, point blank, period.
Yes.
I'm just going to leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to switch the subject now. And because we're almost coming to the end, you've spent a week at the UNGA and you're already exhausted. Some of you already made some adjustments to be here, so I appreciate that. What was one thing, and I keep saying one thing only because otherwise I won't be able to keep you to your time, that really, really surprised you this time, either positive or negative, or the one thing that really made you quite upset? Maybe surprised in a good way and being upset. So it's two things. Richa.
I think surprise in a good way. One thing that I really loved about this past week was the amount of conversations we are having on mental health. There was a WHO event on mental health. There were a lot of young people convening for mental health, many funders and people who want to resource this work convening together. So I think that was something that gave me a lot of hope for the work that we're doing. And especially now where a lot of the cost-effective solutions, the most basic things are more in highlight because of the lack of funding and resources that exist in the world. People are still focusing on intersectional issues. I think that is something that gave me hope.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's very similar for me. I was quite surprised by the number of education funders that wanted to talk about climate. And for me, that was a big change. When we started our fund, we said we are an intersectional fund. We're not going to pick topics. We're not going to say, oh, only energy, water, oceans. Young people care about everything and they want to work in all fields. But a lot of funders were like, no, you have to we need to know where the money is going and you need to define particular themes and programs. And we didn't do that. 3 years on, I was so surprised this week that health funders, education funders, culture and arts funders were coming up and saying, we care about climate and we want to be able to step into this field. How do we do that? So that was really interesting to see. And I think that is a growing shift that I want to see more of. Yeah.
And what were you upset by?
Well, in terms of upset, not necessarily specific to Climate Week, but I was really upset by the number of times people undermine the moment we are in, right? I mean, we're having people detained by ICE. We're having people who are not able to come for Climate Week because of visa issues. And I think it's okay to name that this is a problem and still have an event and not pretend like everyone is in New York. No, not everyone was in New York. There were a lot of people who wanted to be here, who had important things to do here, and they couldn't. There were people who couldn't come because their families have been, separated and they couldn't show up. People who were prevented from flying. And I think for me, that was a bit frustrating that we couldn't, as a community, really name this and say that we are here and we're going to represent, but we also want to call out that we have a significant problem with democracy, and climate and democracy is intertwined. If we get big wins with federal governments that can be reversed, that is a threat, right, on climate, and it's a threat to democracy equally. And I think for me, that is also the intersection of the world we live in, that we need to really not think climate is like so important that we can ignore everything else and we can achieve climate justice is impossible. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly what Josh said. The climate crisis is inextricably linked to the human rights crisis. And I think I was like telling the YCJF team earlier, I had an interview with NPR like a couple of days ago, and it's interesting being even it's even hard for me to say I'm an American citizen because I'm a Native American, I'm Alaskan Native, I'm Indigenous first, right? And one of the first questions that he asked me was, he was like, well, don't you feel angry? Aren't you frustrated about, President Trump's words on climate during the UN General Assembly? And there's this thing that happens in the global community where, they love painting young people, our youth, as these angry, bitter children that don't know what they're doing. And, I was like I identified that, but I was like, no, let's not do this, right? Because, and we were talking about this earlier upstairs, but this world that people are, this reality that finally people are realizing is a thing that Indigenous peoples in this country have been living since we lost sovereignty, right? And in Alaska, that was like what, the 1940s, when Russia sold us to the United States. And our elders, our Yupik elders, described us as a period as when our world literally turned upside down. But despite that, our people were able to successfully relocate, kind of work across borders in Russia to figure out, how do we ensure that we have food in the next winter? These are things that we're still able to do, and that, like, even my language is the second most strongest language in the state of Alaska. That's huge, especially in this country, that despite everything, and despite living in a world where we as Indigenous peoples were no longer like set to exist by policy, federal policy, but even in what the education in which American youth learn, we're still here, strong as ever. And there's a lot to learn from how Indigenous peoples have done that and will continue to do that in the next 3 years.
Well, I think one of the things we all talked about was that in many parts of the world, people have been living with continuing crisis. So my friends in DRC say, welcome to our world. Whereas here, we felt like, how could it be a country that seems so stable, that seems systems are working, that it could go upside down so quickly? And it's happening as we speak. So maybe for once, we have something to learn from all the people who have been actually dealing with these kinds of issues for a long time. So the last question, and then we'll open it up briefly. And I think we should start the question now.
Yeah.
Okay, then we'll come back if I have another question. So floor is yours, and identify yourself, and there's a mic walking around. And so let's take a couple of questions so we have enough time. So we'll take one here and then one there. Okay.
Hi, my name is Kareem. This forum is really important to me since I'm from Laos, and it's I'm the first person to attend Mailman School of Public Health and study epidemiology, and just to hear how you're actually making a change in your community. I wanted to ask, how did you address the disparities in public health literacy among underserved communities when teaching concepts in global health education to local communities? Because I'm sure like not a lot of people know what climate change is, and what strategies did you use to ensure that community members could understand the issues and engage meaningfully with global health initiatives at the local level? Because I know like AI, you need to have adequate literacy to use it.
Said like one more question, and yeah.
Okay. Hi, my name is Anaya, and I'm actually also at the Mailman School of Public Health in Socio-Medical Sciences. And I just want to say thank you guys so much for your diverse experiences and coming here to share it with us. My question was talking about the role of social media, and if this exposure is, I guess, beneficial for raising awareness, or it's just an immense influx of constant information that may be like desensitizing people to certain information going on in the world today. And then also does social media like create a community for the youth, or does it kind of like maybe deepen hyper individualization?
So let's start with the first question and then the second question. And one of you can answer one and another can answer. Yeah, okay.
Really great questions. With the global health literacy, something that we're doing in Alaska, the thing is, it's like I feel like Indigenous communities already understand what's happening. So for me, it's hard to answer that. But I guess like one thing is when we're translating like technical information, especially as a water engineer, when we're building infrastructure for Indigenous communities throughout Southwest, Northwest Alaska. So these are primarily Yupik and Inupiaq communities. English isn't their first language, right? And so one of the things that we're doing on the ground is as engineers, we're translating our plans into Yuktun or Inupiaq, which are Inuit languages, which really ensures that elders understand what's going on, but also our youth in that space. So it's like we're creating this intergenerational dialogue. And I think what happens on the global stage is that world leaders are like, well, I'm only going to have a conversation with important people, right? People my age, people older than me. Whereas in our communities, we've been creating intergenerational dialogues. That's how at the end we make these difficult decisions that end up being incredibly successful. So meeting like you probably hear this a lot, meeting the community where they're at, like forcing them to travel like thousands of miles, like Anchorage or in Washington, D.C., but literally flying on those small planes, taking like a four-wheeler. Some communities we have to fly in a helicopter, which is like really scary, especially for me. But literally traveling to these small communities, so the burden isn't placed on them to get to where we're at, right? So that's, I guess, like one way we translate our technical data as engineers, and then making it personal for them, right? So why is water infrastructure so important? It's important because it's inextricably linked to your public health. And if you don't have access to clean and running water, there's high rates of getting sick, all of these type of things. So also making that clear. And I'll pass the mic for my colleagues to answer.
Take the next question and answer so we can catch a few more. Yeah.
On social media, I think a lot of the research that we do on ground and what we see across the world is how we function on social media and how it affects us has to do with two major things in our lives. One is our sense of agency, and the second is our social networks. And so it really depends where we are, how we feel about how much action we can take to change our own realities as young people. And do we feel like if I'm in a difficult situation, I can get out of it? Or do I feel like I need to pretend my way out of it? And the second is social connection. So in our classrooms, what we see is kids who have a relationship with their parents, an open relationship with their peers, where they feel safe in classrooms, even if they are on social media, even though they're not supposed to be, but they are, because they have high self-esteem, because they have people they can verify and validate their feelings with, they are less likely to be more vulnerable and lonely on social media versus those who feel like they're up against the wall or feel lonely already or feel like helpless and that they can't get out of a situation or a traumatic situation are more vulnerable to adults who are trying to exploit young people online as well. So I think the two major factors are agency and social networks.
Thank you. More questions? Yes.
Thank you for being here. It's good to hear your inspiring stories. So thank you for sharing them. My very dear friend is actually the Hungarian youth delegate to the UN. And since I'm also engaged in a lot of youth engagement work, we're talking a lot about, these challenges that we are facing and like younger people are facing. And I agree with what you said about like, there are more active young people, out there, and you just have to find them. But on the other hand, I also feel that a lot of young people are very passive. Maybe it's because of the anxieties that they are or we are facing, or the uncertainty that we're living in. And my question is that how do you motivate like young people in your local communities? And how do you motivate yourselves as well?
That was going to be my last question, so it's perfect.
Sorry for stealing it. I didn't know that.
Perfect.
I mean, it's a very practical question, right? On one hand, what is a young person? What are they supposed to be? They're supposed to be passive. I mean, when I was growing up, kids just play and do whatever, and adults deal with some issues, and then you get to a certain age, and the responsibilities get passed to you. And that world is changing very quickly. So I think sometimes it's also difficult on what expectations we have on young people. And that has been one of the biggest motivation for me to start the fund, because what I realized was anytime there was an issue, you will find some big institution asking, where are the youth movements? Where are they? They should be angry. They should be out there demanding for accountability. So it's like we have this expectation of young people, putting this responsibility on them, and yet we don't resource them to do that, right? So that passiveness is also about what is the resources we are providing to young people that allow them to be active, because it's very difficult to be active with no resources. So I think that is one thing I'm going to say. And then how do I motivate myself? It's something that Mary Robinson always says, that we all have a duty to ourselves and to our community. I think once you have this basic understanding that this is what it takes to be human, right? You're responsible for yourself, but also you're responsible for the community around you. And that should make sure that everything you do on an everyday basis, you also have holding a sense of accountability of your actions and the implications of that on the people around you. And that keeps me going, knowing very well that, the world I live in today have been shaped by several things and a lot of people who have done incredible amount of work for me to have the life I have today. And I have the same responsibility to create a better version of this for those who come. But then you have to put it into practice. And to be able to put that into practice, you need certain resources, you need access, right? You need to be in community with people, and you should do that. There were something earlier I wanted to comment about on sort of how do we translate concepts to communities. I find this very difficult because, I think we've changed our world in terms of the custodians of knowledge, right? Who are the custodians of knowledge? And who are we trying to explain what concept to, and where do these concepts even come from? And I learned this the hard way of when I first started my work and going to communities trying to tell them about climate, using the knowledge I've had in the classroom, right? And realizing that they have also their own understanding of what is going on, and they have their own version of knowledge, right? Some of it merge, some of it diverge, right? And we have to understand how do we work together with communities to really understand what they know and bridge that with the knowledge that we have gotten through formal education. And I think my biggest sort of advice to everyone is that formal education is not everything, right? It's not the ultimate of knowledge. And we should have a very high sense of humility when we work with communities to really understand what is the understanding of the issue, how are they dealing with it, how do they frame it in their own context, and how do we collaborate with them to be able to do that. But we currently live in a world where that is very low, and we almost have put all of our sort of knowledge into formal education. That is the ultimate knowledge. And this is fundamentally wrong, because a lot of that knowledge still came from conversations with people, right? This research have come from conversations with a lot of local people who are in other parts of the world. And I think part of my vision will be we live in a world where people whose stories shape knowledge actually can get credited effectively for that knowledge, so that we don't get trapped into this idea that there is an ultimatum of knowledge, and that is sort of all these publications that come out, because sometimes it's all based on people's lived experiences all around the world.
Thank you. Any last word?
I'll be quick, sorry. In terms of like how I keep myself motivated, but how do we motivate our youth? There's this thing we have in Indigenous communities, like Indigenous futurism, where we reimagine the reality we have now, right? And so there's things that are integral, like since birth, that you learn as a child. And so for us, what's healing is we're taught that when you return to the land, when you go to the land, you're healing yourself. But when the land isn't healthy, we aren't healthy either, right? And it works both ways. It's a reciprocal type of relationship. And in the Arctic, we're seeing climate change, affect our lands, our territories 4 times faster than anywhere else in the world. And that's a lot to contend with. There's a lot of grief that we hold, but we also, there's this word that I used to not like growing up, but we hold a lot of resilience as Indigenous peoples, right? Especially in the Arctic, and our youth have the ability to really reimagine what our communities look like when we're no longer sinking into the ocean, where we no longer have to relocate, only relying ourselves, realities in which we have enough food, realities in which we have enough salmon, walrus, seal, realities in which there's abundance, but also these dreams, these are things that all youth and children have. And so what motivates our youth, it's not me that motivates them, it's our land, and it's that future that I know exists. It exists there, but it shouldn't be just on us, on youth, but also as Indigenous peoples to solve this crisis, right? It's going to take every single one of us, right? So my dreams also lie in your hands as well. We're creating that reality where our sea ice is no longer melting, where our permafrost is no longer thawing, but realities in which we have enough food. So that's what motivates me. And that honestly, that's what motivates our youth back in the Arctic. So I'll keep it that.
Thank you. Thank you. With that, you can say with all of you, I hope it was inspiring, thought-provoking, reflective. And the truth is, with all of you thinking about this, as Laura said, we're optimistic because sometimes people of our age, we get depressed, and you give us some hope. So please join me in giving a big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.